Our next speaker is Nancy Harrowitz, and she is a research and teaching interest, including 19th and 20th century Italian literature and Holocaust studies. She's a specialist in Primo Levi and has recently published a book entitled Primo Levi and the Identity of the Survivor. She teaches courses on modern Italian literature, on fascism and the Holocaust in Italy, often including films as part of her curriculum. She also teaches courses on Holocaust literature and film, and is directing the new Holocaust Genocide Studies minor, keep that in mind, as we are co-chairing the Conversations on Race initiative. May I welcome you, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have to apologize. First of all, I don't have PowerPoint. I don't have a clicker, so I'm just going to have to entertain you with my words. Literary critics don't usually use the whole visual thing, but anyway, and I'll try not to actually read. So I actually want to dedicate this talk to the memory of Elie Wiesel, who passed away a little over a year ago, who taught here at Boston University for over 30 years. And I'm going to cite from something he said many years ago, which I think is very true today. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. It's easy to ignore chapters of the past that are not dealt with, that are not fully explored, that are not very well understood. And it's especially easy to ignore chapters of the past that generate shame. And I'm going to talk about two representations of events in the past that I think are very connected in thematic ways, as I will explain. The first one is the history of slavery in the United States, and the second one is Holocaust testimony. I'm going to start by talking about Primo Levi as an example of Holocaust testimony. Right after surviving almost a year in the concentration camp of Auschwitz, he came back and wrote a poem entitled Shema. Shema in Hebrew means to listen, but it's even a little more than that. It means to hearken. It's a call to action, the word Shema. The prayer itself is the most important prayer within the Jewish tradition, and it's a call to monotheism. The language of the prayer is all about how you need to listen and know that God is one and that you need to be righteous, follow commandments, but more than anything else, you need to spread the word about there being only one God. So that is the prayer Shema. So why did Levi write a poem and entitle it Shema? Is it just a kind of chutzpah, nerve on his part to appropriate the most important prayer in the Jewish tradition and write about the Holocaust instead? I'll read the poem to you. It's from 1947. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find, returning in the evening, hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman, without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember. Her eyes empty and her womb cold like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I command these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home, in the streets, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children, or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. Levi's own version of the Shema, as you can hear, is a commandment to listen and to remember and to recount what happened in the Holocaust. He secularizes that prayer into a call for Holocaust memory and for writing that memorializes the Holocaust. He really feels strongly that he needs to address his readers in a very direct and challenging way. The poem gives us images of dehumanization, What happened to the slave laborers once they arrived in Auschwitz? Their lives were briefly spared only so they could be worked to death in most cases. Levy explores how a person is dehumanized as they lose their name, their personal identity, everything that makes them human and individual, and to a certain degree, even their soul, as they're brutalized by the system. And Levy also wants us to consider the ultimate results of this kind of degradation. Can a person make it back after being dehumanized? In many respects, the 2013 film, 12 Years a Slave, fulfills a similar goal for the history of American slavery. It's aimed very specifically at American audiences because we needed to listen and to remember this painful episode of the past and think about what dehumanization means not only then but now. The director's decisions regarding what to represent out of the testimony of Solomon Northrup, which was published in 1853, really emphasizes the violence of slavery because he wanted American audiences to really think about it and to get it. So why talk about these two texts together? What do they have in common? The purpose of such an alignment is not to compare suffering, to say, well, one group had it harder than another group, or even to compare directly the historical event because they're not really comparable. They're two very different events. But instead to see what the similarities are that bind our histories together. The film version of 12 Years a Slave caused shockwaves in the US when it was released. How many of you have seen it? Just curious, that's great. There were all kinds of questions that came about. There was a lot of excitement about the film, but there was also some trepidation. And one of the things that came out right away was who was going to be willing to go see it. There were a lot of people who wanted to see it, but who were afraid to. They didn't want to engage with the emotions that the film would engage. And the emotions ranged from rage to guilt. A lot of people did see it, but a lot of people didn't see it. And I thought that was a very interesting phenomenon. For example, do people stay home from a film like The Pianist in 2002, which is a story of a musician in the Warsaw Ghetto, and a very violent film. It's actually much more violent than 12 Years a Slave. You didn't really hear people talking about staying home from that film. So I wondered about that. Let's talk a little bit about the story of Solomon Northrup. Solomon Northrup was a free African-American man living in upstate New York, a musician, happily married with 3 children. He was approached by 2 white men who asked him to go to Washington, D.C. and play violin at an event. He said yes. He went with them to Washington. There he was drugged, he was kidnapped, and he was illegally sold into slavery. He was sent down the river to Mississippi in a slaver's boat. He met other slaves on the boat, some of whom also had been kidnapped, some of whom had run away and were caught again. And they gave him some life lessons because he didn't know how to be a slave. He was a free man. He had no idea how to get through this experience. So they gave him advice. They said, well, don't ask any questions. Just do as you're told. And more than anything, don't tell people that you know how to read and write. Because they didn't want slaves reading and writing. They were afraid that that might be one step towards freedom. So he did pay a very steep price for the kind of an identity conversion that he went through. He had to learn how to be a slave in order to literally save his own life and not be killed. And that's what he does for 12 long years. At the end, he's finally rescued by a Quaker carpenter from the North who's working in the South. And he finally, very reluctantly and with a lot of fear, tells him the story. And the man thinks about it for a while and tries to figure out if he can risk himself by writing to Solomon's friends in the North and telling him what had happened to him. He finally does, and they literally come down and rescue him, and he goes home. What happens when he goes home? His identity has been so changed, he's been so dehumanized by those 12 years of living as a slave and being treated and brutalized as a slave, that he's embarrassed when he goes into his family's home and sees his children and his wife. He's showing a kind of shame legacy that's very common among survivors, whether they're Holocaust survivors, slaves, etc., the kind of shame legacy that goes along with being dehumanized and being treated like that. So that's what happens to him. There are some really strong affinities, aside from the thematic correlations, which I'm going to draw out in a little bit. There are some thematic affinities between Primo Levi and Solomon Northrup. They're in some ways very similar. Solomon Northrup, in his testimony, which, by the way, if you haven't read, I strongly encourage you to read. It's really incredible, very well written, very interesting. He takes a very long view of what happens to him. He tries to be as objective as possible. He even shows some sympathy for some of the slave owners. He might even go a little bit too far, in fact, in showing some sympathy. Not for the really brutal ones, but for the ones who seem to be so caught up in the system they don't really understand what it's done to their own humanity. In fact, he does a very interesting analysis of what happens to the humanity of someone who's owning slaves and brutalizing them, that they can't be really human either. So he's very interesting on that regard. Primo Levi takes a long view also in his testimony, Survival in Auschwitz. He talks about the giant biological and social experiment that is the camp, and tries to understand how dehumanization works and what the parameters are. And he also writes about what it's like to get out of it and to regain his former life. I've taught this film several times in a course on Holocaust representation. You might want to know why I'm teaching a course on American slavery in a course on Holocaust representation, but the answer is very simple. When I first saw this film, I was struck by how many correlations there were to Holocaust testimony. And so the first year, I taught it as a kind of experiment. I wasn't sure if the students would see that or what they would think about it. They were completely fascinated by it. And in fact, they were so fascinated that in the middle of the film screening, they started talking about it. They were just completely stunned that there were so many correlations to Holocaust testimony. But clearly, these histories have a lot in common. And so it really helped the students to be able to get out of themselves, in a sense, and see the effects of dehumanization in a very different context. And so it was actually very successful, and I've left it in the syllabus ever since. I think I'm starting to run out of time, so let me skip ahead a little bit. Let me just say this as a kind of call to action. Using an expansive approach to the testimony of trauma can sharpen our focus on human rights issues in general and on prejudice and its effects. It can also help us reach a broader humanistic and empathetic understanding of the consequences of bigotry in all periods of history, including the current climate in which we find ourselves. Thinking about the film 12 Years a Slave and the painful history of slavery in the U.S. can reanimate our engagement with all atrocities, as it can bring the realities of genocide elsewhere closer to home, closer to our own selves. Once again, it's not a question of comparing traumas and genocides to see what was worse, but rather of understanding what our legacies have in common and drawing upon those histories in order to better illuminate our present and our future path. Thank you.
So we have questions? I found that unbelievably fascinating.
Thank you.
And I am going to take your course.
You're all, of course, welcome to take one of my classes and also to find out more about the Holocaust and Genocide Studies minor, to put in a shameless plug for the minor. Yes, there's someone right there.
Hi, my question, hello, can you hear me? Okay. My question is, how do you engage students and connect in creating like these parallels between two horrific parts of human history? Because obviously students, I believe students would just naturally keep them separate and not create parallels and learn from those mistakes. So how do you engage them in that conversation?
I teach the course at the end, I teach the film at the end of the course. And so it seemed very natural and organic, to tell you the truth, because we'd already talked a lot about Holocaust testimony, about dehumanization, about all of the issues that come along with teaching the Holocaust and with teaching individual stories. Teaching individual stories really helps create empathy and helps people understand to some degree what it might have been like to be in those circumstances. And so if I teach another personal story, which is the story of Solomon Northrup, the connections are really automatic, I think. Probably it wouldn't work at the beginning of the course, but it works very well at the end.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. So you mentioned that you wanted to kind of like raise awareness for this kind of like struggle that the people went through during the Holocaust. Are there any modern day genocides you can think of, and any ways we can get involved towards preventing those in the future?
Oh, yes. I'm not sure I even know where to start. Today I was reading about, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Myanmar, and what's happening there, which is it used to be called Burma, and the genocide that's happening there against the Muslim population, which is horrific. And the government is really just stepping back and saying, well, they're not really part of the country. I don't know if you all read about this. They're saying they're not really citizens. Well, they're really from Bangladesh. Hardly the point. So there's that. There's the kind of racism that's going on in our country, and anti-Semitism, and misogyny that's going on now. Where exactly to start? I think the first place is actually education, to understand the issues so that you can reasonably discuss them with people who may not share your views, and hopefully educate them.
Hi, I saw 12 Years a Slave around the time it came out in, I think, 2013. And I think it's a very important film, but do you feel, we have 12 Years a Slave, The Color Purple, all these slave narratives. Do you think sometimes that, we get caught in ruts where, yes, this is an important film, but now we have all these films about only struggles from people of color? Do you feel that, where maybe there's a time to educate, but also there's a time to maybe stop entertaining audiences in such a way that just only shows people of color in like subservient roles?
I think that's absolutely true. But then we're stuck in between a rock and a hard place, because I want people to know more about these events and to understand that it's a really integral part of American history that we have to deal with. So the popular film can help do that. Does it do a very complete job? No. Is the film 12 Years a Slave very faithful to Solomon Northrup's testimony? Not exactly. It makes him middle class. He wasn't a middle class man. It tries to make him more appealing. There are a whole bunch of points in the film that are really not very historical, but in my view, it's a lot better than nothing.
Hi, so my question goes back to 2 questions ago. So how would you bring someone who does not want to engage in this kind of a conversation, does not want to be educated about it, to kind of listen? Because I feel like that's the problem that we're running into now, is that people have certain ideas that don't mirror what other people think, and so instead of trying to understand it, they would prefer being ignorant.
I think that's true. It's an unfortunate situation. It is a very big problem. I think we just have to keep trying gently so that people don't run screaming or become more entrenched in their reactionary behavior. So I think we just really have to keep trying, keep having conversations. It's really important to have these conversations with people who don't believe the same as you do. It's not an easy task, but I think it's the one that we really have to take on. Am I out of time?
I think you're perfect. I think you're
All right.
perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.